He stood in the marble lobby of the most powerful corporate headquarters in America, a $90 billion empire built floor by floor, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. But he had no idea his wife had built every inch of it. She was the secret CEO, unaware to him, unrecognized by him, underestimated by him. The quiet woman he dismissed every morning over cold coffee, but who commanded boardrooms that shook Wall Street before his alarm clock ever rang. His mistress, who and the secretary with the rehearsed smile and borrowed perfume, clocked in every day to a company she didn't know was owned by the woman whose husband she was stealing. But fate had already begun writing the ending neither of them could read. Then came the morning he chose the lobby over love. He divorced her in public, in front of cameras, colleagues, even cold strangers, announcing his decision like a press release. But what he failed to announce was that he was signing his own financial death warrant. His mother had kicked her out first, threw her suitcase onto the front porch like unwanted cargo, called her worthless, called her replaceable. But no one in that house knew they were evicting the woman whose signature kept 3 Fortune 500 companies breathing. He rushed to marry his secretary, the very woman whose salary was approved each month by the wife he just discarded. But the celebration was barely over before the universe began pulling back the curtain, slowly, mercilessly, and with perfect timing. And then, on the same street where he humiliated her, where his mother cursed her, where the cameras captured her tears, a limousine rolled to a stop. And then came the sound no one expected, the heavy rotation of a helicopter descending from above, sent not by coincidence, but by a $90 billion empire responding to its CEO's first distress call. What she did next left him speechless. What followed that moment left him bankrupt. But here's the question that should stop you cold. How do you divorce a woman in public and not know she owns the company your mistress works for? How does a mother throw out a daughter-in-law and not know she is evicting a billionaire? And what kind of woman says nothing, endures everything, then lets a helicopter and a limousine do all the talking? Dear viewers, this story will teach you that silence is not weakness. It is strategy. It will show you that the most powerful person in the room is often the one being underestimated. When you will learn the true cost of arrogance, disloyalty, and the danger of judging people by what they carry, not who they are. As you watch, ask yourself, what would you have done differently? Drop your answers in the comments. I want to hear your lessons. And if this story moves you, educates you, or makes you think twice, subscribe now, because more powerful, life-changing stories like this are coming every week. Don't miss a single one. Raymond Whitfield had a habit of looking at his wife the way people look at furniture they have stopped noticing. Present, familiar, occupying space but never truly seen. He looked at her every morning across the breakfast table, but his eyes had long stopped carrying any real curiosity about who she was, what she carried, or what she was quietly building while the rest of the world slept. Eleanor Whitfield was 41 years old, but she moved through their home with the quiet discipline of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was not weakness. It was armor. She was slender, composed, with dark eyes that held the kind of depth that only comes from carrying enormous things in silence. She wore simple clothes at home, linen blouses, flat shoes, her hair pulled back without ceremony. But Raymond had never once asked himself why a woman who dressed so plainly always seemed to command every room she entered without raising her voice. He had stopped asking questions about Eleanor years ago, but that was his first and most costly mistake. What Raymond did not know, what he had never known, because he had never been curious enough to look, was that every morning, 45 minutes after he left for his mid-level project management job at Hargrove and Associates, a black car arrived silently at the side entrance of their Connecticut estate. Eleanor would emerge from the house transformed. Tailored charcoal suit, structured briefcase, the quiet authority of someone who had earned every inch of the ground they stood on, and be driven to Whitfield Global Headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, where her name was on the building. Her name, not a coincidence of marriage. Her name because she had built it. 12 years earlier, Eleanor had been a 29-year-old financial strategist with a vision so precise and so far ahead of its time that 3 separate venture capital firms had fought to back her. She had launched Whitfield Global, named for the family name she would later share with a man who never deserved the honor of carrying it, and had grown it from a $4 million seed fund into a $90 billion multinational conglomerate that operated across 22 countries, employed over 140,000 people, and had been featured on the cover of Forbes 3 times. But the world knew her only as E. Whitfield, a name deliberately kept androgynous in press materials, a face rarely photographed, a CEO who communicated through an elite inner circle, and a board of directors bound by ironclad confidentiality agreements. She had chosen invisibility strategically, but she had also chosen it personally, because when she had married Raymond 8 years ago, she had wanted just once in her life to be loved simply. Not for the empire, not for the billions, simply for Eleanor. Raymond had seemed, in those early years, like the answer to that quiet prayer. He was charming then, attentive, warm, the kind of man who remembered small things. But wealth changes the atmosphere around people even when they cannot see its source, and Raymond had grown comfortable in a life he mistook for his own achievement. The estate he assumed his salary maintained, the accounts that never ran dry, the connections that opened doors he thought his handshake had unlocked. All of it, every thread, led back to Eleanor. But Raymond never pulled the thread. 3 years ago, Diane Harlow had walked into Raymond's office at Hargrove and Associates as his newly assigned executive secretary, and Raymond had looked at her the way he had stopped looking at his wife, with attention, with hunger, and with the reckless interest of a man who had confused boredom for wisdom. Diane was 29, ambitious in the narrow way that mistakes proximity to power for power itself, and she had recognized in Raymond a man whose ego could be steered. What Diane did not know, could not have known, because the universe has a particular taste for irony, was that 3 weeks before she accepted the position at Hargrove and Associates, she had also submitted a secondary application to Whitfield Global's communications division. That application had been approved. Her onboarding paperwork at Whitfield Global had been processed, signed, and authorized at the executive level. Authorized by Eleanor. Diane Harlow was, without knowing it, employed by the wife of the man she was dismantling a marriage to reach, and every paycheck she had ever received from Whitfield Global bore the invisible fingerprint of the woman she called Raymond's boring wife over restaurant tables she thought were private. But the morning everything began to unravel did not start with a revelation. It started with a phone call. Raymond's mother, Margaret Whitfield, sharp-voiced and immovable as ever, telling her son that she had made a decision about his wife. And Raymond, as he always did when his mother spoke, listened without question. Margaret Whitfield had never liked Eleanor, but not for any reason she could say aloud without exposing the shallowness of it. Eleanor was too quiet for Margaret's taste, too self-contained, too unbothered by the social performances that Margaret had built her entire identity around. A woman who didn't gossip, didn't compete, didn't flinch under pressure was, to Margaret Whitfield, a woman hiding something. But Margaret had never once considered that what Eleanor was hiding was something far beyond her comprehension. Margaret had arrived at the Connecticut estate on a Thursday morning with 2 things: a Louis Vuitton carry-on she had not been invited to bring, and a decision she had already made without consulting anyone who mattered. She walked through the front door Raymond held open for her, swept her gaze across the home she had always resented for being more elegant than anything she could have furnished herself, and sat at the head of the dining table, as though the deed were in her name. "She has to go." "Raymond," Margaret said, before her coat was even off. "I've made up my mind. This marriage is a dead thing, and you're too proud to admit it. Diane is good for you. Diane understands you. That woman," she tilted her head toward the hallway where Eleanor had just appeared, composed and unhurried, "has never been right for this family." Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, but said nothing. She looked at Margaret the way a chess grandmaster looks at an opponent who has just made a move they believe is clever, with patience and with the quiet knowledge of exactly how the board would end. Raymond did not look at his wife. He looked at his hands. That was the second time he chose the easier direction, but it would not be the last. By Friday evening, Margaret had moved her carry-on into the guest suite and moved her opinions into every corner of the house. She had gone through Eleanor's wardrobe and called it uninspiring. She had criticized the way Eleanor organized the kitchen, the way she answered phone calls, always briefly, always stepping out of the room, and the way she never seemed rattled, which Margaret interpreted as coldness, but which was, in truth, the practiced calm of a woman who negotiated nine-figure deals before most people had finished their morning coffee. On Saturday morning, Margaret told Eleanor to pack a bag. "You can come back for the rest," Margaret said, standing in the bedroom doorway with her arms folded, Raymond standing half a step behind her, like a shadow that had forgotten how to act independently. "We'll have the papers drawn up. Raymond has already spoken to his attorney." Eleanor looked at Margaret. Then she looked at Raymond, really looked at him, the way she had not allowed herself to in years, searching perhaps for one last trace of the man she had married, the man who had once held her hand in a rainstorm outside a restaurant in Boston and told her she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. There was nothing there, just a man who had chosen comfort over courage, and a mother who had chosen control over wisdom. Eleanor nodded once. She pulled a single pre-packed overnight bag from the closet, already prepared, as though she had known this morning was coming, and walked out of her own home without a single tremor in her step, but not before pausing at the front door and looking back at the house with the expression of someone closing a chapter they had already finished reading. Raymond had chosen Aurelius, the most visible, most photographed restaurant in Greenwich, for the divorce, but Eleanor had not known that when his attorney called to request her presence for a brief formality. She arrived at noon in a simple ivory blouse and dark trousers, calm and punctual, and was led to a table near the center of the dining room where Raymond was already seated. Diane Harlow was at a table 12 feet away, facing them directly. It was not a coincidence, but Eleanor's expression did not change when she saw her. Raymond slid the envelope across the white linen tablecloth without preamble, without eye contact, without the basic human decency of lowering his voice. "Honorana, I think we both know this is right," he said, loud enough for the two adjacent tables to hear, loud enough for the couple near the window to turn their heads. "I've moved on, Eleanor. I think it's time you did the same." A woman at the next table gasped softly. A man near the entrance stopped chewing. Eleanor looked at the envelope. She looked at Raymond. She looked briefly and deliberately at Diane, who dropped her gaze immediately, her manicured fingers tightening around her water glass. And then Eleanor did something that Raymond had not prepared for, that Diane had not prepared for, that no one in Aurelius' restaurant that afternoon had prepared for. She smiled. Not the smile of someone defeated, not the brittle smile of someone holding back tears. It was the slow, settled smile of someone who had just watched the last obstacle between themselves and their destiny remove itself voluntarily. The smile of a woman who knew something the entire restaurant did not. She picked up the envelope, slid it into her bag without opening it, stood with the unhurried grace of someone in no danger whatsoever, and said quietly enough that only Raymond could hear, "You have no idea what you just set free." Then she walked out of Aurelius into the pale afternoon light, flagged no car, made no call, and disappeared around the corner. While Raymond sat at the center of the restaurant he had chosen for her humiliation, suddenly and inexplicably cold, as though the temperature in the room had dropped the moment she left it. Diane crossed the room and sat in Eleanor's vacant chair, but even she, in the flush of what felt like victory, noticed that the seat was not warm. 2 blocks away, Eleanor turned a corner, stopped walking, and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of stillness. 4 seconds in which her composure fractured, just barely, just privately, just enough for a single slow breath that carried 12 years of patience, sacrifice, and silent love out into the Connecticut afternoon air. Then she straightened. Then she reached into her jacket pocket, not her bag, her jacket pocket, and pulled out a phone. Not the personal phone Raymond knew about, the other one, the one with the direct line to her chief of staff at Whitfield Global. "Clear my schedule for Monday," she said when the line connected, "and tell the board I'm done being invisible." She ended the call. Elle looked up at the sky above Greenwich, a sky that seemed, in that moment, wide enough to hold everything she was about to reclaim, and walked forward. Monday morning arrived in Manhattan the way significant mornings always do. Ordinary on the surface, historic underneath. The streets were loud with the usual rhythm of the city, but inside the glass tower on Fifth Avenue, whose lobby bore the name Whitfield Global in letters 3 feet tall, something had shifted before the first elevator opened. Eleanor's chief of staff, a precise and unflappable woman named Carolyn Voss, had sent one internal memo to the board of directors at 6:47 a.m. It contained 11 words. E. Whitfield will be entering the building publicly this morning. Prepare accordingly. By 8 a.m., every senior executive on floors 30 through 42 had read it. By 8:15 a.m., the board of directors was assembled in the executive conference room on the 40th floor, straightening ties and collecting composure. Because in 12 years of working for Eleanor Whitfield, not one of them had ever received a memo like that. Because in 12 years, Eleanor had never once walked through the front entrance. She had always used the private entrance, always arrived in the black car, always kept the boundary between her public silence and her private authority clean and uncrossed, because she had been protecting something or someone who, as of Friday afternoon in a Greenwich restaurant, had made that protection unnecessary. At 8:31 a.m., the revolving doors of Whitfield Global's main lobby turned and Eleanor walked in. She wore a deep navy suit that she had never worn to the side entrance. It had never worn in the black car, had never worn anywhere Raymond might have seen. A suit that had been waiting in her office wardrobe for a morning exactly like this one. Her hair was down. Her stride was unhurried but absolute. The stride of someone who does not need to announce themselves, because the building already knows their name. The lobby went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when authority enters them. Not from instruction, but from instinct. The receptionist, a young man named Patrick, who had worked the front desk for 2 years and had never once seen the CEO in person, stood without meaning to, a reflex like standing for a national anthem. Eleanor looked at him with the same warmth that she had always carried beneath everything else and said, "Good morning, Patrick. You can sit down." He sat, but he did not stop staring. She crossed the lobby, stepped into the executive elevator, and as the doors closed, she looked straight ahead with the expression of a woman who had just finished one life and was walking without hesitation into the next. On the 19th floor in the communications division, Diane Harlow arrived at 8:45 a.m., carrying a coffee she had treated herself to, wearing a new blouse she had bought over the weekend to celebrate what she believed was the beginning of her real life. She had spent Saturday evening with Raymond, Sunday morning with Raymond's mother, who had embraced her with the warmth she had withheld from Eleanor for 8 years, and she had arrived at work that Monday morning feeling, for the first time, like a woman who had won. She settled at her desk, opened her computer, and found an internal company-wide memo waiting at the top of her inbox, sent at 6:47 a.m., before she had even woken up. She read it once, then she read it again. E. Whitfield will be entering the building publicly this morning. She frowned at the name, but only the way you frown at something familiar that you cannot immediately place. The way a word looks strange when you stare at it too long. She clicked on the sender profile. Caroline Voss, Chief of Staff to the CEO. She clicked on the CEO profile. The page loaded slowly, but the photograph loaded first. Diane Harlow's coffee cup met the desk at an angle, but she did not notice. She did not notice because she was staring at a professional photograph of Eleanor Whitfield. Her Eleanor, Raymond's Eleanor. Weren't the woman she had dismissed across restaurant tables and whispered about in borrowed confidence. Seated at the head of a boardroom table, with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to own every room she entered. The name beneath the photograph read, Eleanor Whitfield, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Whitfield Global Enterprises. Estimated net worth, $90 billion. The floor beneath Diane's chair did not move, but she gripped the desk as though it had. Across town in the Connecticut estate that Eleanor had walked out of 3 days earlier, Raymond Whitfield was eating breakfast and feeling for the first time in years entirely satisfied with himself. But satisfaction, like most things Raymond had built his life upon, was resting on a foundation he had never once thought to inspect. His phone buzzed. A notification from his bank. He glanced at it the way a man glances at things he does not expect to surprise him, casually, briefly, without real attention. Then he looked again. The joint investment account, the one that had always carried a balance that Raymond had always assumed was the natural product of his own career, read $0, not low, not reduced. Zero with the clean, final precision of a deliberate action, not an error. He switched to the estate account, the household operations account his mother had praised just yesterday for its generosity. Zero. He opened the account tied to his corporate memberships, his club dues, the quiet financial infrastructure of a life he had mistaken for his own. Zero, zero, zero. He sat very still at the breakfast table where Eleanor had once sat across from him every morning. The table she had bought, in the home she had financed, on the estate her company had quietly maintained. And he felt for the first time the specific and terrible vertigo of a man who has just looked down and discovered there is no ground beneath his feet. His mother appeared in the doorway with her morning tea, but Raymond did not look up. "Mother," he said, his voice arriving from somewhere distant and hollow, "whose name do you think is on this house?" Margaret opened her mouth, but for the first time in Raymond Whitfield's memory, his mother had nothing to say. 3 floors above Diane's desk at Whitfield Global, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the full Manhattan skyline, Eleanor sat at the head of her boardroom table for the first time without a confidentiality shield between herself and the world. Her board of directors sat around her, 12 of the most accomplished financial minds in the country, and every one of them was watching her with the particular attention of people witnessing a historical moment they would describe to others for the rest of their careers. Carolyn Voss stood at the door and asked if Eleanor was ready. Eleanor looked out at the skyline, at the city she had built a $90 billion empire inside of, quietly, patiently, without applause. And then she looked back at her board and said simply, "Send the car and prepare the helicopter. It's time she came home properly." The limousine arrived at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, but it did not arrive quietly. Out it turned onto the tree-lined street in Greenwich where Eleanor had walked out of Aurelius restaurant 4 days earlier with nothing but a pre-packed bag and a single sentence that Raymond had spent every hour since trying to unhear. It moved slowly, deliberately, the way powerful things move when they have nowhere urgent to be because everything is already arranged. A long, black, mirror-polished vehicle that caught the afternoon light and threw it back at the street like a quiet declaration. It stopped directly in front of Aurelius. Raymond was there, not by coincidence, but because Margaret had insisted they lunch at Aurelius again, the scene of what she called the liberation, as though dignity lost were freedom gained. He was seated at the same center table, with his mother across from him and Diane at his side, and in the first public appearance of what Margaret had already begun describing to her social circle as Raymond's fresh start. But fresh starts built on someone else's foundation do not hold. Raymond saw the limousine through the restaurant window first, saw it and felt nothing, because men who have never earned what they possess rarely recognize the symbols of real power when those symbols are not pointed at them. He looked away. He reached for his water glass. Then the sound began. It started as a vibration, felt before it was heard, a low rhythmic percussion that moved through the floor of the restaurant and up through the soles of every shoe in the room. The chandelier above the center table trembled, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the windows. The sky above the street, which had been pale and unremarkable, was suddenly occupied. A helicopter descending with the unhurried authority of something that had been sent, not summoned, its body bearing the 2 letters that made Raymond's water glass stop halfway to his mouth. W.G. Whitfield Global. It landed in the wide intersection 200 feet from Aurelius, an intersection the Greenwich Traffic Authority had apparently been notified to clear, because it was clear, because when you operate a $90 billion company, the world makes room for you, and the rotor wash moved through the street like an announcement, pressing against the restaurant windows, lifting the edges of tablecloths, reaching inside the room where Raymond sat and touching every person in it. The limousine door opened. Eleanor stepped out. She was wearing the navy suit, the one that had waited in her office wardrobe for precisely this morning. And she stood on the Greenwich sidewalk outside Aurelius' restaurant with the full, unshielded, unhidden authority of the woman she had always been, but had chosen, out of love, to keep private. Behind her, two members of her executive security team took position. Caroline Voss stood at her left shoulder with a structured leather portfolio. The helicopter idled in the intersection, its rotors slowing but not stopping, because this was not a long stop. This was a moment, choreographed not for spectacle, but for truth. The entire street had stopped. Pedestrians stood still. A delivery driver sat in his truck with the window down, watching. Three people on the sidewalk had their phones raised, but not for the reason people usually raise phones outside restaurants. Not for food, not for vanity, but because they were witnessing something that felt, instinctively, like history. Inside Aurelius, Raymond stood up from the center table. He did not decide to stand. His body stood without his permission, the way bodies respond to things the mind has not yet processed. Margaret's teacup hovered between the saucer and her lips, suspended, forgotten. Diane could not move at all. Eleanor did not look at the restaurant immediately. She looked at the street, at the ordinary, indifferent, beautiful street where she had once walked away from 12 years of marriage with 4 seconds of private grief and a phone call that changed everything. And she breathed it in, just once, with the way you breathe in a place you are seeing clearly for the first time. Then she turned and looked through the restaurant window. She found Raymond's eyes without searching for them, the way people who have shared years always find each other in a crowd, by instinct, by the particular gravity of shared history. She looked at him for a long, still moment, long enough for him to see, without any possibility of misunderstanding, exactly who she was, exactly who she had always been, and exactly what he had signed away in the same restaurant 4 days ago. She did not smile this time. She did not need to. She simply held his gaze for 3 seconds, unhurried, unafraid, unbroken. And then she looked away from him, the way you look away from something you have finished with completely, and turned toward Caroline Voss. "Where's the Hargrove account?" Eleanor said, her voice carrying the particular quiet of someone who does not need volume to command attention. "Proceed with the acquisition." Caroline nodded once and opened the portfolio. What Eleanor had not said to Raymond, what she had never needed to say, because the documents said it with the clean, irrefutable language of financial law, was that Hargrove and Associates, the mid-level firm where Raymond had spent 8 years believing he was building a career, had been quietly acquired by Whitfield Global subsidiaries over the preceding 18 months. The acquisition had been finalized on the same morning Eleanor had walked out of the Connecticut estate with her pre-packed bag, finalized and held, deliberately held, for the right moment. That moment was now. By 3 p.m., Tuesday, Raymond's position at Hargrove and Associates was formally dissolved in the restructuring that followed the acquisition announcement. By 4 p.m., the Connecticut estate, held in a property trust that Eleanor's attorneys had structured 8 years ago, a detail Raymond had signed without reading at a closing he had attended with champagne confidence, reverted fully to Eleanor's sole ownership. By 5 p.m., Raymond's attorney called to inform him that every financial instrument, every account, every asset he had believed was jointly held had been established, maintained, and legally structured under Eleanor's corporate umbrella, and that his claim to any of it was, in the precise language of the law, non-existent. He was not merely left without comfort, he was left without foundation, because the foundation had always been hers, and she had simply finally stopped holding it beneath him. Diane Harlow tendered her resignation from Whitfield Global by email at 4:47 p.m., but her resignation was declined by Caroline Voss with a single line. Ms. Harlow's employment contract includes a non-disclosure and non-compete clause enforceable for 5 years. HR will be in touch. She sat in her apartment that evening, the apartment whose lease Raymond had promised to help upgrade in a future that no longer existed, and stared at a wall, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that she had spent months dismantling a woman she had never actually seen, that the wife she had called boring had signed her paychecks, that the marriage she had celebrated destroying had been the only thing standing between Raymond and the financial reality he was now standing inside, alone, With no inheritance of competence to fall back on. Margaret Whitfield called Raymond 7 times between 5 and 7 p.m. He answered the third call, but there was nothing useful either of them could say to the other, because Margaret had thrown a billionaire off her son's porch and called it good mothering, and Raymond had divorced the architect of his entire life in public and called it courage, and now both of them were sitting in the wreckage of decisions made in arrogance, discovering too late that arrogance has no structural integrity. Eleanor did not watch any of it unfold. She was already elsewhere, in her corner office on the 40th floor of a building that bore her name, with the Manhattan skyline spread before her like a map of everything she had built without applause. Reviewing the quarterly projections her board had prepared, answering the emails that had accumulated during the 4 days she had given herself to grieve, and eating takeout from the Thai place 2 blocks over that Caroline always ordered from when board meetings ran past 8. She was, by every measure that mattered, exactly where she had always been, but she was finally, completely, and without apology, visible. She looked out at the skyline a final time before closing her laptop, and she thought, not of Raymond, not of the restaurant, not of the helicopter or the limousine or the street where she had allowed herself 4 seconds of grief, but of the 29-year-old woman who had sat in a borrowed office with a $4 million seed fund and a vision so precise it had frightened even the people who believed in it. That woman had built all of this, but had believed for 8 years that love required her to hide it. She would not hide anything again. The most dangerous thing you can do to a powerful person is underestimate them. But the most dangerous thing a powerful person can do to themselves is shrink for someone who was never worthy of the sacrifice. Eleanor did not destroy Raymond. Raymond dismantled himself with arrogance, with blindness, with the casual cruelty of a man who looked at something extraordinary every morning and saw nothing worth his curiosity. Margaret did not lose a daughter-in-law. She evicted her own family's future with both hands and called it a decision. Diane did not steal a life. She borrowed a role in a story whose ending was already written, in a building whose owner she had never thought to look up. And Eleanor simply stopped being invisible. The limousine was not rescue. The helicopter was not revenge. They were punctuation. The universe's way of ending a sentence that had gone on too long and beginning the next one at full volume. Dear viewers, this story was written for you because somewhere in it is a mirror. It teaches you that your silence is not your weakness, but it should never become someone else's permission to diminish you. It teaches you that the people who underestimate you the most are often the ones most dependent on what you quietly provide. It teaches you that real power never needs to announce itself, but when it finally does, the whole street stops. Watch yourself. Know your worth. Never shrink for a room that cannot hold you. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments. What lesson hit you hardest? And what would you have done if you were Eleanor? Let's talk about it. And if this story moved you, taught you, or made you see yourself differently, subscribe right now. Because every week we bring you stories that entertain, educate, and remind you of exactly who you are.